He thought he was just picking up his daughter from school, until a poor boy saved her life, and revealed a truth that changed everything. Matthew Carter wasn't used to witnessing things he couldn't control. He had built his empire with precision, every risk calculated, every decision executed with cold efficiency. As the CEO of one of the country's top investment firms, he was a man whose voice could move markets. Yet nothing in his professional life could have prepared him for what he saw that afternoon outside his daughter's elementary school. The day had been routine, at least on the surface. Meetings, calls, contracts. He left the office earlier than usual, checking his watch as his black SUV pulled up outside the school gates. His driver stepped out, but Matthew motioned for him to stay. He preferred to greet Haley himself, especially now. His 6-year-old daughter had broken her leg 3 weeks earlier during a playground accident. She was brave about it, too brave sometimes. Walking on crutches, refusing help, smiling through pain. She reminded him so much of her mother it hurt. That day, instead of waiting for one of the teachers to escort her across the small street in front of the school, Haley had insisted she could manage on her own. He saw her from across the street, determinedly making her way down the curb, balancing the weight of her backpack, wobbling slightly on her crutches. At first, he smiled, proud, amused, affectionate. Then she slipped. It was a quick, terrifying moment. Her foot caught the edge of a crack in the sidewalk, her crutches jolted, and her injured leg folded awkwardly beneath her. She let out a gasp, and her body swayed forward toward the street, toward a slow-moving car that was just far enough away to make time feel cruelly suspended. But before he could react, before he could even call her name, someone else moved. A boy, no older than 8, darted forward from the sidewalk. Thin, small, wearing a faded red hoodie and sneakers that looked too big for his feet. His blonde hair was messy, and his pale face was flushed from the cold. He caught Haley by the arm with surprising steadiness and guided her back onto the sidewalk. Not roughly, not panicked, gently, like someone used to being careful. Matthew was already halfway across the street by the time he reached them. His heart was pounding. Haley looked shaken but unhurt. She clutched her crutches and blinked up at the boy beside her, who was now brushing off his jeans like nothing had happened. "Be more careful next time," the boy said to her, smiling. "Crutches are tricky." Haley nodded, still catching her breath. "Thanks." Matthew crouched beside her and checked her leg quickly, his hands moving with the calmness of practiced worry. Then he turned to the boy. "You helped her," he said quietly, still processing. "Thank you." The boy looked up at him. Blue eyes, clear, steady, and older than they should have been. He shrugged. She needed help. There was something about him that struck Matthew immediately. The clothes were clean but old, the backpack slung over his shoulder looked nearly empty, and his shoes, tied with mismatched laces, had holes near the toes. But it wasn't pity that gripped him. It was something else. Something quieter. "Where are your parents?" he asked, not harshly, just curious. The boy didn't hesitate. "They're gone. I'm by myself." Matthew froze. He didn't mean to show it, but the words hit him like a blow to the chest. The boy said it so plainly, so matter-of-factly, as if he had accepted it long ago and had no need to explain further. Haley, still recovering from the scare, reached out and touched the boy's hand. "Do you want to meet my dog?" she asked innocently, as if that might fix everything. The boy smiled. "I like dogs." Matthew stood there, in the middle of the sidewalk, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him like fog. His driver stood by the car, unsure whether to approach. The world around them kept moving, cars passed, teachers waved goodbye to students, a gust of wind blew a crumpled piece of paper across the pavement. But something had shifted. Matthew looked at the boy again, this child who had appeared out of nowhere, who had protected his daughter with a stranger's instinct and then declared, without bitterness or sadness, that he had no one. Matthew Carter had made a career out of recognizing opportunity. But what he felt in that moment wasn't a business instinct. It was the sudden, undeniable pull of something more. Something he hadn't felt in years. Something dangerously close to fate. Matthew couldn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the city beyond his windows, his mind cycling endlessly through the same image, that boy's face, his small hand steadying Haley, and the quiet way he'd said, "I'm by myself." The words weren't dramatic or self-pitying. They were stated as fact, with a calmness that didn't match his age. That's what disturbed Matthew most. It wasn't the tragedy of it, it was the normalization. As if being alone in the world was just something the boy had learned to carry like a coat too big for his shoulders. He got up before sunrise, restless, and made his way to the kitchen where the lights were soft and the silence sharper. He poured himself a cup of coffee but didn't drink it. Instead, he stood by the window, watching the darkness slowly peel back from the skyline. He didn't know the boy's name. He didn't know where he came from. But something inside him wouldn't let it go. He was a man used to solving problems with resources, people, money, access, but this wasn't a problem to fix. It was something deeper, something human. For the first time in years, he felt like a man staring at a story he didn't yet understand. Later that morning, while Haley ate breakfast and told him a long, winding story about a classmate who had tried to glue googly eyes to her crutches, Matthew casually asked if the boy from yesterday went to her school. "No," she said between bites of cereal. "I've never seen him before. I think he was just there. Maybe he was walking by." He nodded but didn't respond. He didn't want to alarm her, and he certainly didn't want to make her feel responsible. After dropping her off, he instructed his driver to circle the blocks around the school. For the better part of 2 hours, he scanned the sidewalks, parks, store entrances, anywhere a child might linger without drawing too much attention. Nothing. By the third hour, Matthew had called in a quiet favor from someone in the city's administrative offices, a friend who owed him. He asked for any recent missing child reports, unofficial shelter admissions, or unaccompanied minors flagged by police. Still nothing. The boy was invisible, or at least outside the system. That realization unsettled Matthew more than anything else. In his world, data was everything. People left traces, social security numbers, tax records, school forms. The idea that a child could live in a major city without a footprint made him feel like he was standing in a house where the walls didn't hold. Later that day, Matthew returned to the school at dismissal time. He stood near the gate, talking idly with one of the teachers about Haley's progress, his eyes constantly scanning the sidewalk, the bus stops, the alleys across the street. And then he saw him. Same hoodie, same oversized shoes, a little more dirt on his jeans. The boy was sitting on the edge of a planter across the street, eating what looked like a half-eaten granola bar. Matthew excused himself and crossed over. As he approached, the boy looked up and froze, cautious but not afraid. He didn't run. He didn't smile. He just waited. "You're here again," Matthew said, stopping a few feet away. The boy nodded, chewing slowly. "You waiting for someone?" "No." "Are you staying somewhere nearby?" "Sort of." Matthew studied him. There were dark circles under his eyes, and though he looked alert, there was a tension in his shoulders, the kind of constant readiness that came from sleeping in unsafe places. His backpack was zipped shut, but Matthew could see it sagged almost flat. No books. No lunchbox. No change of clothes. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Lucas." "How old are you?" 8. "Where are you sleeping, Lucas?" Lucas hesitated. "Library sometimes. Or stairs. Depends." Matthew felt something shift in his chest. He had donated millions to children's charities, funded shelters, spoken at galas. But this was different. This wasn't charity. This was a boy who had saved his daughter from harm and then returned to vanish into a city that didn't care if he survived the night. "Would you let me get you something to eat?" Matthew asked. Lucas paused again, then nodded slowly. "Okay." They sat in a quiet diner 2 blocks away. Lucas ordered pancakes and orange juice. He ate like someone used to not knowing when his next meal would come, careful but fast, not wasting a bite. He didn't talk much. Matthew didn't push. He listened. When Lucas did speak, it was in short, precise sentences. His mother had died 6 months ago from a long illness. They'd had no family left. After she passed, a neighbor called Child Services. He ended up in a shelter, but it was crowded, loud, and cruel. He left. No one came after him. "I didn't like it there," he said, almost apologetically. "People yelled a lot." Matthew nodded. "I understand." Lucas looked at him. "Do you?" Matthew took a long breath. "Maybe not all of it. But I understand not wanting to be somewhere that doesn't feel safe." Lucas didn't respond. He just kept eating. When the check came, Matthew paid and then asked the question he'd been carrying all day. "Would you like to come stay at my house for a while? Just for tonight. You'll have your own room. A warm bed. No one yelling." Lucas blinked at him. "Why?" Matthew hesitated. "Because you helped my daughter. And because you look like someone who deserves better than this." There was a long silence. Finally, Lucas whispered, "Okay. But just for one night." Matthew smiled, not pressing further. One night. That was enough, for now. He had no idea what would come next. But as they walked out of the diner side by side, something told him the moment he'd seen Lucas steady his daughter wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. Lucas didn't say much during the car ride. He sat in the back seat beside Haley, who was chatting excitedly about the pancakes he'd just eaten and telling him all the things they had at home: a huge bookshelf, a dog named Biscuit, a playroom with too many pillows, and a freezer full of the good ice cream, not the boring kind. Lucas nodded politely, responding with quiet smiles and the occasional, "cool," or "really," but he never let his body fully relax. His fingers stayed curled in his lap, his eyes drifting often to the window as if memorizing the streets in case he needed to run later. Matthew watched all of it through the rearview mirror. His instinct was to ask questions, to offer reassurance, to make the boy feel safe. But instead, he held back, sensing that Lucas didn't need words right now. He needed space. So Matthew focused on driving, letting Haley do the talking while Lucas observed the world with the quiet wariness of someone who had learned not to trust comfort too quickly. When they pulled into the driveway, Lucas's eyes widened, just slightly. The house was modern and spacious, tucked behind a tall hedge and a security gate, nothing overly flashy, but clearly far from the world he'd been surviving in. Biscuit, a scruffy golden retriever mix, came barreling toward the front door as they entered, tail wagging in a full-body blur. Haley laughed and dropped her crutches carefully so she could give him a hug. Lucas froze in the doorway, not sure if he was allowed to step inside. "You can come in," Matthew said gently. "This is your home too, for tonight." Lucas stepped inside slowly, his movements careful and precise. He looked up at the high ceilings, the clean white walls lined with photographs and framed drawings, some of which Haley proudly announced were hers. He didn't say a word, but his eyes moved constantly, absorbing everything. Matthew led him to the guest room at the end of the hall. It was usually used for visiting family or friends, but it had a twin bed, a window with thick curtains, and a small bookshelf with a few forgotten novels on the bottom shelf. Lucas walked in like he was entering a museum. He ran a finger along the edge of the desk, glanced at the clean bedsheets, and whispered, "It smells nice in here." Matthew set down a fresh towel on the dresser and said, "There are clean clothes in the closet, some extras from Haley's cousin. They might be a bit big, but they're warm." If you need anything, just knock. I'll be right down the hall. Lucas nodded but said nothing. When Matthew left the room, he waited a full 5 minutes before he moved again. He closed the door softly and sat on the edge of the bed, bouncing slightly, testing its firmness. Then he stood up, opened the closet, and stared at the clean shirts and folded jeans. He didn't touch them, not yet. He looked at the towel, the books, the lamp beside the bed, and then at the window. He walked to it, pulled back the curtain just enough to see the street, memorizing the distance between the sidewalk and the front door. It was what he always did in a new place: map the exits, check the locks, build the escape route in his head. But that night, no one shouted. No one slammed doors. No one turned off the heat or left him alone in the dark. After dinner, grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, which he ate with grateful silence, Haley showed him how to play one of her favorite board games. Lucas was hesitant at first, afraid to laugh, unsure whether this was something he was actually allowed to enjoy. But Haley was a force of nature. She teased him for being too serious, insisted he used the lucky token, and told him flat out that she didn't care if he lost, only that he played. He smiled. Just once. But it was real. That night, after Haley had gone to bed, Matthew checked in on Lucas. He expected to find the boy asleep or maybe curled up on top of the blankets. Instead, he found him sitting at the desk with the lamp on, holding one of the books from the shelf. He wasn't reading it, just looking at the pages slowly, carefully, as if the story might disappear if he turned them too quickly. "You okay?" Matthew asked softly from the doorway. Lucas nodded, not looking up. "I don't think I've ever had a room before." "Not really. Not just mine." Matthew hesitated. "You don't have to be alone in it. If you need something, anything, you just come find me. Understand?" Lucas nodded again. Matthew turned to leave but stopped when he heard the boy speak again. "I don't know how to be here." Matthew didn't answer right away. He stepped back into the room, knelt so they were eye level, and said, "You don't have to know. You're not expected to. All I care about is that you're safe, and warm, and not scared. That's it. Everything else, we'll figure out together." Lucas stared at him for a moment, eyes narrowing slightly as if testing whether the words were true. Then he gave the smallest nod and whispered, "Okay." That night, he slept under the covers. Not curled in a corner, not with one eye open. Under the covers. And when Matthew peeked in before going to bed himself, he saw that the book Lucas had been holding was now tucked under his pillow. It was a small thing. But sometimes, the smallest things mean a door has quietly opened in someone's heart. And Matthew knew that however temporary this had started, this boy wasn't just a visitor anymore. Over the next few days, something shifted in the house, not drastically, not in a way that anyone could easily point out, but in a quiet, undeniable current beneath the surface. Lucas remained cautious, but he no longer flinched at every unexpected sound. He began accepting second helpings at dinner without waiting to be asked, and once, Haley caught him humming under his breath while drawing with her at the kitchen table. Matthew noticed it all. He didn't comment on it, didn't bring attention to Lucas's slow softening, but he acknowledged it in other ways, by gently including him in more routines, by making sure Lucas had his own place at the table without being told, by asking him questions that didn't pry but reminded him he mattered. The third morning, when Lucas was still asleep, Matthew stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment. The boy had kicked one leg out of the blankets during the night and was curled on his side, the pillow hugged close, the same book still under his head. It hit Matthew then, not just the weight of what this child had lived through, but the staggering simplicity of what he seemed to need: stability, warmth, someone who didn't disappear. That morning, as Haley got ready for school, Matthew made a decision he hadn't allowed himself to consider fully until then. He was going to keep Lucas safe. Not just for a night, not just until the system found a place for him, but for as long as the boy wanted to stay. And if the system resisted, he'd fight it. The process began that day. Matthew met with a private attorney who specialized in family law. He explained the situation in detail, not hiding the fact that Lucas had been living on the streets, not trying to sanitize the truth. The lawyer, a calm woman named Margaret with a sharp mind and clear compassion in her eyes, listened carefully and then said what Matthew already knew. If he's not registered anywhere, no birth certificate on file, no foster record, no school enrollment, he's going to be almost invisible on paper. That can be good or bad. Good because there's no one to contest custody. Bad because it means we have to build an identity for him from the ground up. That takes time. And while we do that, someone may try to move him back into the state's custody. Matthew clenched his jaw. Then we move faster. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You're willing to fight this in court? Yes. You understand what kind of attention that may bring. You're a public figure. This could get loud. I don't care about noise, he said, his voice steady. I care about that boy. Margaret nodded. Then we'll start today. Over the next few weeks, Matthew did something he hadn't done in years. He slowed down. He rearranged his schedule, delegated more of his corporate obligations, and prioritized being home. He drove Haley to school himself, let Lucas pick out his own clothes for the day, even when the results were mismatched, and sat with both kids at the table while they did their homework. Haley adapted immediately. She never questioned the shift, never asked why Lucas was staying so long. To her, it simply made sense. He had helped her, so now they helped him. She treated him like a brother from the beginning, with the same mixture of teasing, loyalty, and fierce affection that only children seem to master so effortlessly. But not everyone was as accepting. When word began to spread that Matthew Carter had taken in a homeless boy, the speculation started. A few tabloids hinted that it was an image play, a publicity stunt. One gossip blog suggested Lucas might be an illegitimate child from a secret affair. Matthew ignored it all, but the noise grew louder when a particularly invasive journalist published photos of Lucas and Haley at a local park, framing the story as a billionaire's attempt at redemption. It wasn't just headlines. Matthew received a formal notice from the state, requesting a hearing to assess the temporary housing situation. The language was cold, legal, full of vague concern. It didn't accuse him of wrongdoing, but it questioned his long-term intentions. Lucas found the letter accidentally. It had been left on the kitchen counter, and when Matthew walked into the room, the boy was holding it, his hands trembling slightly. I can leave if it's causing trouble, he said quietly, not looking up. Matthew's voice was firm but gentle. You're not going anywhere. Lucas shook his head. They'll take me. They always do. Matthew crossed the room and knelt in front of him. No. Not this time. You're not a burden, Lucas. You're family. I don't care how long it takes or how hard it gets. I'm going to fight for you. Lucas looked at him then, really looked at him. There was disbelief in his eyes, but also something softer, hope trying to find a place to land. He didn't say anything, just nodded and held on to the letter like it was proof of something, even if he wasn't sure yet what it meant. That night, as Matthew lay in bed, he felt the weight of what he was doing settle fully onto his shoulders. This wasn't a business deal. There were no guaranteed outcomes, no projected returns. This was about a child, one who had trusted him not to vanish like everyone else had. And Matthew, for the first time in his life, wasn't interested in controlling the future. He just wanted to earn it. The night before the custody hearing, a storm swept through the city. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rumbled low across the skyline like the growl of something ancient and unsettled. Inside the Carter home, the atmosphere was calmer but undeniably tense. Lucas had been quieter than usual all day. He'd sat through dinner without saying much, picked at his food, and later declined Haley's offer to play cards, saying he was tired. He had gone to bed early, or at least pretended to. Matthew noticed. He always noticed now. He stood outside Lucas's bedroom door for a moment, debating whether to knock, then decided to let the boy have his silence. Not everything needed to be solved with words. But later that night, just before midnight, he heard a soft sound, a barely audible rustle, followed by the creak of the hallway floorboards. When he stepped out, Lucas was standing by the front door in his socks, holding his backpack tightly to his chest. Matthew didn't raise his voice. He didn't panic. He simply walked over and sat down on the bottom stair near the door, waiting. Lucas froze when he saw him but didn't run. His eyes were glassy with unshed tears, his jaw clenched like he was holding everything together with sheer force. "I wasn't going to steal anything," Lucas said quickly, before Matthew could speak. "I was just going to leave. I can't mess this up for you." Matthew remained seated, his expression calm. "Why would you think you're messing anything up?" Lucas looked down at his feet. "Because you're in trouble now. People are writing things, and tomorrow, they might take me away. If I leave first, maybe they won't bother you anymore." Matthew's heart cracked open in a way he hadn't thought possible. He rose slowly and walked over to Lucas, kneeling so they were at eye level. "Lucas," he said gently, "you are not trouble. You're not a problem to fix. You're not something I'm tolerating. You are part of this family. I don't want you to go. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not ever." Lucas wiped his face with the sleeve of his hoodie, but the tears kept coming now, fast and hot. "They always say stuff like that. Then they leave. Or I have to." "I won't," Matthew said, without hesitation. "And if you ever feel scared again, I want you to come to me. Not the door. Me." There was a long silence between them, thick with emotion. Then Lucas stepped forward and leaned into him, awkwardly at first, like someone learning a language they were never taught. Matthew wrapped his arms around him and held him tightly, feeling how small and light he still was, how much of his body was made of fear he had no business carrying at such a young age. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the clouds lingered. They arrived at the courthouse early, accompanied by Margaret, the attorney, and a court-appointed child psychologist who had interviewed Lucas in the weeks prior. Haley stayed home with a trusted nanny, unaware of the full stakes of the day but confident, as only a child could be, that her brother would come back home no matter what. Lucas sat beside Matthew in the waiting room, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt, his knee bouncing with nervous energy. The boy had worn one of his new collared shirts and combed his hair carefully, but he still looked like someone waiting to be punished for something he didn't do. When they were called into the courtroom, the space felt larger than it needed to be, the walls sterile and indifferent. The judge was a woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes but a tired kindness beneath her formality. She asked the usual questions, about Matthew's employment, living situation, relationship with Lucas, intentions regarding long-term guardianship. Matthew answered calmly, clearly, without theatrics. Then the judge turned to Lucas. "Do you feel safe with Mr. Carter?" she asked. Lucas hesitated only a second before nodding. "Do you want to continue living with him?" Lucas looked at Matthew, then back at the judge. His voice came out small, but certain. "Yes. He doesn't pretend to care. He really does. And he doesn't leave." There was a pause in the room. Even Margaret looked down briefly, affected by the raw honesty in that quiet answer. The psychologist gave her professional evaluation, recommending in strong terms that Lucas remain in Matthew's care. "This is not a temporary arrangement born of pity," she said firmly. "This is a stable, nurturing home. The child has made visible emotional progress under Mr. Carter's guardianship, and the bond between them is authentic and mutually beneficial." The judge took a few minutes to review the documents. Then she looked up, hands folded in front of her. "In the absence of any viable biological guardianship and in consideration of the child's well-being, I am approving the petition for full legal custody. Lucas Carter will be officially recognized as the legal son of Matthew Carter, effective immediately." Matthew exhaled slowly, relief flooding him. He turned to Lucas, who blinked like he hadn't quite understood what had just happened. "It's official," Matthew said, voice low and smiling. "You're home." Lucas didn't smile at first. He looked down, then back up, and suddenly threw his arms around Matthew's neck, holding him tightly with a strength that came from every moment he'd ever been afraid to hope. That night, there were no reporters at the gate. No headlines in the papers. No loud declarations. Just a boy with a new last name, a man who had chosen to stay, and a family that had been formed not by blood, but by a decision to love without conditions. The weeks that followed the court's decision unfolded in quiet, steady rhythm. There was no sudden transformation, no grand emotional climax, just the gradual unfolding of a new normal, one built on stability, choice, and trust. Lucas no longer waited for permission to enter a room. He no longer flinched when someone raised their voice in another room or double-checked the exits before going to sleep. He began sleeping with his door closed, not because he was afraid of being seen, but because he finally believed no one would leave while he wasn't looking. Haley adapted seamlessly, as if nothing monumental had changed except the name she now used when introducing Lucas. "This is my brother," she'd say proudly to anyone who asked. Not, "foster brother," or "friend," or "just staying with us." Brother. Lucas, for his part, took some time to accept the word, not because he didn't want it, but because he had never been called anything that permanent before. School brought its own challenges. Lucas had been out of the system for almost a year, and even before that, his attendance had been spotty. He struggled with basic math and reading comprehension, though it was clear he was intelligent, just behind. Matthew hired a tutor, a patient woman named Evelyn, who came 3 times a week and treated Lucas not as a problem to be fixed but as a mind waiting to be reawakened. She never made him feel small for not knowing something. Instead, she celebrated the moment he figured it out. Lucas began looking forward to her visits more than anyone expected. One evening, while helping him with fractions at the dining table, Evelyn said gently, "You're not bad at this, you just never had someone sit with you long enough." Lucas didn't reply, but something shifted in his posture. He sat up straighter, leaned in, and tried again. Matthew continued to reshape his own life around this new reality. Meetings were now carefully scheduled to avoid missing bedtime stories. Boardrooms were exited early when school projects needed help. His staff adapted quickly, seeing the subtle but undeniable change in their boss. He hadn't become softer, but he had become more human. The man who used to measure time in billable hours now measured it in chapters read, dinners shared, and moments missed if he wasn't paying attention. The media storm eventually faded. Another scandal took its place in the news cycle, and the public's attention drifted, as it always does. The whispers about Matthew adopting a homeless boy turned into a footnote in online articles. But inside the Carter household, something far more important was taking root, a family, shaped not by resemblance or shared bloodlines, but by consistent presence and growing affection. One afternoon, Matthew returned from a meeting early to find the house quiet. Haley was at a play date. The tutor had just left. He walked past Lucas's room and noticed the door slightly ajar. Inside, Lucas was sitting on the floor, surrounded by pages of pencil drawings, comic book panels, each one more detailed than the last. Matthew had seen him doodle before but never like this. The drawings told a story, a young boy in a cape who didn't fly, but walked city streets, helping people, always alone until one panel showed him being offered a hand. Matthew knocked gently on the doorframe. Lucas looked up, startled at first, then relaxed. "Those are good," Matthew said. "You draw better than I ever could." Lucas shrugged, embarrassed. "Just something I do when it's quiet." "Can I ask what this story's about?" Lucas hesitated, then gave a small smile. "It's about a kid who doesn't have a superpower. Just good eyes. He sees things other people miss." Matthew nodded. "Sounds like a hero to me." Lucas looked down at his drawing. He doesn't feel like one. Sometimes heroes don't, Matthew said. They just do the right thing anyway. Later that evening, Haley returned home and dragged Matthew into the living room to watch her rehearse a short scene for a school play. Lucas joined them on the couch, curling his knees to his chest, watching with a relaxed ease that was new. When the scene ended, Haley bowed dramatically, and Matthew clapped as if she were on Broadway. Lucas clapped too, smiling at her with genuine pride. Afterward, they had dinner, spaghetti, which ended in a minor noodle-throwing war between the kids. Matthew laughed, even as he wiped tomato sauce off his shirt. He hadn't remembered laughter feeling like this in a long time, easy, real, earned. That night, while tucking Lucas into bed, Matthew paused at the doorway. "Hey," he said, "about those drawings, if you ever want to do something more with them, like enter a contest or make a book, I'll help you. I mean it." Lucas's voice was quiet but firm. "Thanks. I might want to. Later." Matthew nodded. "Take your time." Lucas hesitated, then said, "I used to think families were just people you're stuck with. But this is different." Matthew stepped back in and sat on the edge of the bed. "How is it different?" Lucas looked at him, his voice barely above a whisper. "You chose me. You didn't have to. But you did." Matthew swallowed the lump in his throat and leaned forward, placing a hand gently over the blanket. "I'll choose you every day, Lucas. That's what family means." For the first time, Lucas reached out and held Matthew's hand in return. That night, the house felt warmer, even though the weather outside had turned cold. And somewhere down the hallway, in a quiet room that used to belong to no one, a boy who had spent far too long alone finally fell asleep without fear. It was early spring when the letter arrived. The trees outside the Carter home were just beginning to show hints of green, and the air had that soft warmth that made windows stay open a little longer and footsteps linger on porches. Haley had just returned from school and was bouncing through the hallway, already talking about a class field trip. Lucas trailed behind her, quieter but relaxed, his backpack slung over one shoulder, cheeks slightly flushed from the walk. Matthew was in the kitchen, sorting through the mail, half listening to their chatter when he came across the envelope. It was thin, plain, handwritten with no return address. The name on the front was simple, Lucas Carter. Matthew felt his chest tighten slightly. It was rare for Lucas to receive mail, and even rarer for it to come with no sender listed. He set it aside on the counter, unsure whether to give it to Lucas immediately or check its contents first. But something inside him, some growing trust, perhaps, told him to let the boy decide. Later that evening, after dinner and a short movie, Lucas noticed the envelope on the kitchen counter. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands like it was something delicate. Matthew watched from a respectful distance, waiting. "Can I open it?" Lucas asked quietly. "It's addressed to you," Matthew replied. "You don't need permission." Lucas sat down at the table, carefully tearing the flap. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. As he unfolded it, Matthew could see the subtle change in the boy's face, not alarm, not fear, but something more complex, recognition. Lucas read in silence for a long moment, then read it again. When he looked up, his eyes were glassy, but his mouth was curved in the faintest smile. "It's from someone who knew my mom," he said finally. His voice was calm but filled with something Matthew hadn't heard in it before, peace. "A woman she worked with at a diner a long time ago. She didn't know I was still alive until she saw a news article. She said my mom used to talk about me all the time." Matthew stepped closer, gently. "What did she say?" Lucas looked back down at the letter and read aloud, "She used to tell me, my son is special. One day someone will believe in him, and he'll do great things. He just needs someone to see him." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Matthew sat down across from him, watching as Lucas held the letter to his chest. It wasn't a long message, not dramatic or poetic, but it hit like thunder. The boy who had spent so long thinking he had been forgotten had just been reminded that someone, somewhere, had remembered him. And more importantly, that his mother had believed in him until the end. "Do you think she'd be proud of me?" Lucas asked quietly. Matthew didn't hesitate. "I think she'd be in awe of you." Lucas nodded slowly, folding the letter with care and slipping it into his notebook, between two blank pages he used for his drawings. Then he got up and walked over to Matthew, who stood as well, unsure if Lucas was about to leave the room or ask something else. Instead, the boy hugged him. It wasn't the careful, tentative hug of the past, or the spontaneous squeeze of gratitude from a child unsure of affection. It was a deliberate, full-hearted embrace, arms wrapped tightly around Matthew's middle, face pressed into his chest, breathing deep and steady. Matthew wrapped his arms around him in return, holding him just as tightly, aware of the significance of this simple act. Haley entered the kitchen a moment later and tilted her head at the sight of them. "Did I miss something?" she asked playfully. Lucas pulled back, wiping his face but smiling. "Just a letter." Haley, never one to be left out, walked over and hugged them both without asking for an explanation. And for a minute, they stood there, an unlikely family formed not by chance, but by choice, by the difficult, beautiful effort of staying when leaving would have been easier. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, Matthew sat alone in the living room with a cup of tea and thought about the letter. He thought about Lucas's mother, about how she must have clung to hope even as everything around her collapsed. He thought about the thousands of small decisions that had led them all here, to this house, this peace, this family. It hadn't been easy. None of it was. But he realized, in that still moment, that the best things in life rarely are. He got up, walked to Lucas's room, and peeked in. The boy was asleep, the letter still tucked into the notebook on his desk. Beside it, a new drawing, one Matthew hadn't seen before, lay half-finished. It was a picture of three people standing in front of a small house with a big tree. A man, a girl, and a boy. Above them, written in large, uneven letters, were the words, "We belong here." And for the first time in a long time, Matthew didn't feel like a man who had lost something. He felt like a man who had found exactly what he didn't know he was missing. By the time summer arrived, the Carter household had settled into something that felt less like a routine and more like a life. It was no longer remarkable that Lucas had his own toothbrush, his own drawer of socks, his own place at the table. It was no longer strange that his name was written on the side of his backpack, or that Haley introduced him without hesitation as her brother. These things had become normal, even mundane, and yet they carried a quiet power, the kind of power that comes from repetition, from security, from the daily choice to stay. Lucas had started calling Matthew Dad. There was no ceremony, no build-up. It happened one morning over cereal. He asked, "Dad, can we go to the park after lunch?" And Matthew's spoon froze midair before he looked up and simply answered, "Of course." That was it. No one spoke about it afterward, and no one needed to. The word fit. It felt earned, not given, and Lucas never took it for granted. One particular morning, Lucas was up earlier than usual. The house was quiet, sunlight filtering in through the kitchen windows, catching flecks of dust in the air. He sat at the counter with a piece of toast in one hand, the other busy flipping through a sketchbook full of characters he'd been creating for weeks. There were pages and pages of rough comic panels, a boy with a flashlight that never ran out of batteries, a girl who could fly but only when she was laughing, a dog that barked riddles. His imagination had opened like a window during a storm, and he was finally learning not to shut it again. Matthew entered the kitchen with a stack of mail and a cup of coffee, pausing when he saw Lucas already awake. "Early start?" he asked, leaning on the counter. Lucas shrugged with a small smile. "Couldn't sleep. Had an idea." Matthew nodded and glanced down at the sketchbook. "You ever think about showing these to someone? A publisher? A magazine?" Lucas hesitated. "They're just for fun." "They're more than that," Matthew said. You have something here. Something real. Lucas looked down at the drawings again, this time with something more like belief in his eyes. He didn't answer, but he didn't dismiss it either. That afternoon, the three of them attended a local youth storytelling event at the community center. Haley had signed up to read one of her poems, and Lucas had quietly submitted a short comic script under a fake name, too nervous to claim it openly. The hall was filled with families, some big, some small, some loud, some cautious. It felt safe. Warm. The kind of space Lucas used to avoid but now found himself relaxing into, even enjoying. When Haley went up to the microphone, her voice shook at first, but then she found her rhythm. She read about stars and shadows and how sometimes, love sounds like footsteps that never leave. The room was silent, listening, and when she finished, the applause was genuine. Lucas clapped the loudest. A few speakers later, the coordinator read Lucas's comic aloud. The crowd laughed in all the right places and leaned forward during the quiet moments. When it ended, the room applauded again, and Lucas, though not named, looked around as if trying to hold the moment in his hands. Matthew leaned down and whispered, "Proud of you." Lucas didn't say anything, but his smile stretched wider than it had in days. As summer deepened, the family took a small vacation, a road trip upstate, just the three of them. They stayed in a cabin near a lake, roasted marshmallows, told ghost stories, and let their phones go dark for a few days. One night, sitting beneath a sky scattered with stars, Lucas asked Matthew, "Did you ever think this would happen?" Matthew, watching the fire crackle, replied, "Not once. But I'm glad it did." "Me too," Lucas said. I think Mom would be okay with this." Matthew looked at him, saw the honesty in his face, the vulnerability that had once been buried under fear and doubt. "I think she'd be more than okay," he said. "I think she'd be proud." Lucas didn't cry, but his eyes shimmered in the firelight, and he didn't look away. The final morning of the trip, Lucas woke up early and wandered down to the lake alone. The water was still, the mist rising like breath from the surface. He sat on a log near the shore, knees pulled to his chest, and let himself be quiet. Not because he was afraid, or sad, or planning his next move, but because he didn't need to run anymore. He belonged here, in this moment, in this life. Back at the cabin, Matthew and Haley were packing up, and when Lucas returned, he helped without being asked. They worked in easy silence, the way real families often do, not filling space with talk, but sharing it without hesitation. When they arrived back home later that day, Lucas walked through the front door and paused. The house smelled like them now. Like dinners cooked together, like laundry folded and left on the stairs, like the vanilla candle Haley insisted on lighting after school. He dropped his bag and stood still for a moment, letting the weight of home settle on his shoulders not as a burden, but as comfort. Matthew walked past him, ruffled his hair, and said, "Welcome back." Lucas looked up and answered, "It's good to be home." And it was. In every sense of the word. Nick Hale had built his entire life on control. He was a man who anticipated every outcome, who never let emotions interfere with logic. But all it took was one evening, one quiet dinner in an unremarkable restaurant, for his world to shatter. The moment he heard a child's quiet sobs, he hadn't expected to care. The moment he saw her wide blue eyes, his blue eyes, he hadn't expected to feel. And when her mother turned around, pale and frozen, whispering his name like a ghost from the past, he knew nothing would ever be the same again. Because the little girl wasn't just a lost child. She was his daughter. And he had never even known she existed. Nick Hale was used to control. In business, in negotiations, in life, everything followed a plan. There were no surprises, no missed opportunities, no loose ends. That was how he built his company, how he maintained his success. But tonight, for the first time in years, he had stepped away from the structured world of corporate meetings and investor dinners and chosen something different. He wanted a quiet meal, somewhere away from the usual luxury, somewhere he could be anonymous. He found himself in a small, family-owned restaurant on the outskirts of the city. It was warm and welcoming, with the scent of freshly baked bread and grilled steak filling the air. The kind of place where people weren't in a rush, where laughter filled the booths instead of hushed business conversations. The waitresses bustled between tables, greeting regulars by name, and there was a hum of familiarity in the air. Nick chose a table by the window, ordering a steak and a glass of wine. He allowed himself a rare moment to simply sit and breathe, to look around without the weight of deadlines pressing down on him. It was strange, how unfamiliar relaxation felt. He was about to take his first sip of wine when a sound cut through the gentle murmur of the restaurant, a soft, trembling sob. He glanced up, scanning the room until his gaze landed on a small figure near the counter. A little girl sat on the floor, her tiny shoulders shaking as she wiped at her face with small fists. She couldn't have been older than 4. Dark curls framed her round face, and even from a distance, Nick could see the bright blue of her eyes, filled with tears. Something in his chest tightened. He wasn't the kind of man who got involved in personal matters, let alone the problems of strangers. But something about this little girl, sitting alone on the floor of a busy restaurant, looking lost and scared, made it impossible to look away. He pushed back his chair and stood, crossing the room in a few strides. He crouched down beside her, making sure not to startle her. "Hey," he said gently. "Are you okay?" The little girl sniffled, looking up at him with tear-streaked cheeks. "I'm lost," she whispered. Nick felt a surprising pang of concern. He had expected to hear something like, "I dropped my toy," or "I spilled my drink." But lost? That was different. He glanced around, scanning the restaurant for a panicked parent, but no one seemed to be searching for a missing child. That only made his concern grow. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. The girl hesitated, then wiped her nose with the sleeve of her tiny sweater. "Lily." Nick nodded, offering her a reassuring smile. "That's a beautiful name, Lily. Where's your mom?" Her lips wobbled again, and she shook her head. "She was here, but then she went away. She said she'd be right back. But then I couldn't find her." Nick exhaled slowly, realizing what must have happened. If her mother worked here, she had probably stepped away for just a moment, expecting Lily to stay in one spot. And Lily, being a small child in a busy restaurant, had wandered off instead. He wasn't sure why he felt so compelled to help. He could have called a waitress over, let them handle it, gone back to his table and his untouched steak. But something about Lily's wide, frightened eyes kept him in place. "Your mom works here?" he asked. Lily nodded. "She's a waitress." That confirmed it. Nick looked around again, spotting a few waitresses weaving between tables, their trays balanced on their arms, but none of them seemed to be looking for a child. "All right," he said. "Let's find her together, okay?" Lily hesitated for only a second before slipping her small hand into his much larger one. The warmth of it surprised him. He wasn't used to holding something so small, so delicate. It felt unfamiliar. But as they walked together through the restaurant, searching for Lily's mother, Nick had no idea that this moment, this small, seemingly insignificant decision, would change his life forever. Nick walked slowly through the restaurant, his large hand carefully holding Lily's tiny one as he scanned the busy room. The warmth of her fingers felt strangely fragile against his palm, and he found himself gripping her just a little tighter, as if afraid she might slip away. Lily stayed close to him, her free hand clutching the hem of her small sweater. Her big blue eyes darted around the restaurant, looking for a familiar face, but the more they walked, the more uncertain she seemed. "Do you remember where she was when you last saw her?" Nick asked, keeping his voice gentle. Lily hesitated, then pointed toward the far side of the restaurant, where a counter stood with stacks of menus and a cash register. "She was over there," she said. But she went to take food to someone, and then I didn't see her anymore. Nick nodded, leading her in that direction. The restaurant was still bustling, but as they moved closer to the counter, something shifted. A voice cut through the noise, frantic, full of worry. Lily. Lily immediately perked up, turning toward the sound. A woman rushed toward them, weaving through tables with the urgency of someone who had been searching for far too long. She wore a simple black dress, an apron tied around her waist, and her brown hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail. Her dark eyes were wide with panic until they landed on Lily, and relief washed over her features. Lily's face lit up. "Mommy!" Before Nick could react, the little girl let go of his hand and ran straight into her mother's arms. The woman scooped her up, holding her tightly against her chest. "Oh my God, baby, where did you go?" Her voice wavered as she smoothed Lily's hair, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I told you to stay near the counter." "I did," Lily mumbled into her shoulder. "But then I didn't see you, and I got scared." The woman exhaled shakily, closing her eyes for a brief second before pulling back to check her daughter's face. "Are you okay? You're not hurt?" Lily shook her head. "I'm okay." Nick, who had taken a step back to give them space, found himself frozen as the woman finally lifted her gaze to look at him. And in an instant, everything shifted. Nick knew those eyes. The color was different, dark brown instead of Lily's bright blue, but the shape, the way they widened in shock, the way they reflected something raw and unspoken, it was all too familiar. He knew her. She knew him. A moment of silence passed between them, stretching long and heavy. "Nick?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, like she didn't quite believe what she was seeing. Nick felt something tighten in his chest. He hadn't heard that voice in years, but he still recognized it. "Rose," he said, his own voice lower than usual. Her grip on Lily tightened slightly, as if on instinct. Nick couldn't move. He couldn't think. Because now that he was looking at her, really looking at her, a realization hit him so hard it nearly knocked the air from his lungs. Lily. Dark hair. Blue eyes. She wasn't just any little girl. She wasn't just a lost child in a restaurant. She looked exactly like him. Nick's stomach dropped. He felt his hands curl into fists as he forced himself to breathe. He turned his gaze back to Rose, his jaw tightening. "Tell me the truth," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. His heart pounded as he asked the question that would change everything. "Is she my daughter?" Rose felt her breath catch in her throat. Her arms instinctively tightened around Lily, as if she could somehow shield her daughter from the weight of the moment. She had imagined this scenario countless times, had thought about what she would say if she ever saw Nick again. But she had never been prepared for the real thing. Nick stood in front of her, his broad shoulders tense, his blue eyes locked onto her with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. He had always had that presence, the kind that demanded answers without having to say much. But now, there was something different in his gaze, something raw, something she couldn't escape. "Is she my daughter?" His voice was quieter this time, but the demand in his tone remained. Rose's heart pounded in her chest. She had always known this day would come. She just hadn't expected it to happen in the middle of a crowded restaurant, with Lily's small arms wrapped around her neck, oblivious to the storm that was about to break. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. Lying wasn't an option. She had already kept the truth from him for years, and she knew there was no way to deny it now, not when Lily was standing right there, looking like a miniature version of him. Rose closed her eyes for a brief second before meeting his gaze again. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's yours." The silence that followed was deafening. Nick didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable, as if he were trying to process the weight of what she had just said. Rose braced herself for anger, for accusations, for anything, but the look in his eyes wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, something almost like betrayal. How long? His voice was controlled, but she could hear the tension beneath it. Rose swallowed hard. 4 years. Nick exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. 4 years, he repeated, as if saying it out loud would make it feel real. He looked back at Lily, who was watching them both with quiet curiosity, completely unaware of the meaning behind their conversation. Why didn't you tell me? His voice was lower now, but there was no mistaking the sharp edge to it. Rose's fingers curled slightly against Lily's back. Because you had your whole life ahead of you, she said, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. You were building an empire. You had investors, meetings, deals worth millions. You were traveling across the world, barely stopping for anything. She broke off, shaking her head. I didn't want to be the person who held you back. Nick let out a quiet, humorless laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. Held me back. His blue eyes burned into hers. You didn't think I had the right to make that choice for myself? Rose's chest tightened. I thought I was doing the right thing. Nick's jaw clenched. The right thing? His voice was lower now, rougher. You decided for me, Rose. You decided that I didn't deserve to know my own daughter. That I didn't deserve to be there for her. Rose flinched, guilt weighing heavy on her shoulders. It wasn't like that. Then tell me what it was like, Nick shot back, his frustration finally breaking through his usually controlled exterior. Tell me how you justified keeping her from me for 4 years. Rose exhaled slowly, feeling the sting of his words. I was scared, she admitted. I was scared that you would see her as a mistake. That you would feel trapped. That you would resent both of us. Nick's expression flickered for a second, but then his jaw tightened again. You don't know that. You're right, Rose whispered. I don't. Because I never gave you the chance. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with emotions neither of them knew how to process. Finally, Nick took a slow breath, his gaze shifting back to Lily. The little girl was still nestled in her mother's arms, playing with the hem of her sleeve, completely unaware of the turmoil surrounding her. Nick crouched down, leveling himself with her. Hey, Lily, he said, his voice softer now. Lily blinked at him with wide blue eyes. Hi. Nick hesitated for only a second before asking, do you know who I am? Lily tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. Then she glanced at Rose, as if searching for confirmation before looking back at him. You're the nice man who helped me, she said matter-of-factly. Nick let out a breath, nodding. Yeah, he said. I'm the nice man who helped you. He hesitated, his voice quieter now. But I'm also something else. Lily's brow furrowed slightly, curiosity shining in her bright blue eyes. What? Nick swallowed hard. His throat felt tight, like the words were caught somewhere deep inside him. He had spent years closing himself off, keeping emotions buried beneath layers of business and control. But looking into his daughter's eyes, the eyes that were just like his own, there was no room for anything but the truth. I'm your dad, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily blinked at him, as if trying to process his words. She glanced at Rose again, then back at Nick. Really? Nick forced a small smile, even though his chest felt like it was about to collapse under the weight of everything. Yeah, he said. Really? Lily stared at him for another long second before a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Oh. Nick let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Then, to his complete surprise, Lily reached out and took his hand. Nick felt his entire body go still. Her fingers were small, delicate, warm. And for the first time in his life, Nicholas Hale, the man who had built an empire from nothing, the the man who had never let anyone in, felt like he had just found something more important than anything he had ever built. Nick stared down at the small hand wrapped around his own, feeling something shift deep inside him. Lily's fingers were so tiny, yet they gripped his hand with the kind of quiet confidence that made his chest tighten. He had spent years negotiating million-dollar deals, standing in boardrooms with some of the most powerful people in the world, and yet he had never felt as unprepared as he did at this moment. Lily's blue eyes, his eyes, blinked up at him with innocent curiosity, as if waiting to see what he would do next. She wasn't scared. She wasn't pulling away. She was just there, holding his hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. Nick swallowed hard, his mind racing. He should have been furious. He should have been demanding answers, demanding to know why Rose had kept this from him for so long. But standing there, looking at Lily, the only thing he could think about was how much time he had already lost. For years. For years of first words, first steps, bedtime stories, scraped knees, and laughter, memories he would never get back. Rose's voice broke the silence. "Lily, sweetheart, why don't you go sit at the counter for a minute? I need to talk to," she hesitated, glancing at Nick before finishing, "I need to talk to Mr. Hale." Lily looked between them, sensing the tension in her mother's voice, but she didn't argue. She simply gave Nick's hand one last squeeze before letting go and skipping over to the counter, climbing onto a stool with ease. The second she was out of earshot, Nick turned to Rose, his jaw tight. "We need to talk. Now." Rose exhaled, nodding. "I know." Nick clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. "Why?" The word came out rough, edged with too many emotions he hadn't had time to process. "Why didn't you tell me?" Rose looked away for a second, her arms crossing over her chest as if bracing herself. "Because I was scared," she admitted. "Because I thought if I told you, you'd feel trapped. That you'd feel like you had to choose between your life and a child you never planned for." Nick let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "That wasn't your choice to make, Rose. You don't get to decide how I would have felt. You don't get to erase me from my own daughter's life because you assumed I wouldn't want her." Her jaw tightened. "You weren't ready, Nick. I knew it. You knew it. You were working 18-hour days, traveling across the world, building your company. You didn't even have time for yourself, let alone for a baby." Nick took a step closer, his blue eyes burning into hers. "That doesn't mean I wouldn't have tried." Rose flinched slightly at his words, but she didn't look away. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she whispered. Nick exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. "Well, you weren't," he said, his voice lower now. "You robbed me of 4 years. You took away my right to know her, to be there for her. And now I'm just supposed to accept that." Rose's throat tightened. "I didn't do this to hurt you, Nick." "But you did," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "You hurt both of us." Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything left unsaid. Nick took another breath, forcing himself to think past the anger, past the resentment. He couldn't change the past. No matter how much he wanted to, no matter how much it ate at him, those 4 years were gone. But Lily wasn't. His voice was steadier when he spoke again. "I'm not walking away from her, Rose." Rose swallowed hard, nodding. "I didn't expect you to." Nick studied her, searching for any sign that she was still going to fight him on this. But all he saw was exhaustion. Guilt. And maybe something else, something like relief. He glanced over at the counter, where Lily was happily swinging her legs, playing with a small napkin like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. His daughter. He turned back to Rose. "We need to figure this out. For her." Rose nodded again, her voice softer this time. "Yeah. We do." For the first time that night, Nick felt like he was finally taking control of something again. But this time, it wasn't about business or power. It was about being a father. Nick had spent his entire life solving problems, negotiating impossible deals, and turning obstacles into opportunities. But as he sat across from Rose in the small booth of the restaurant, he realized this was the one situation he couldn't approach like a business transaction. There was no strategy, no quick fix, no contract that could rewrite the last 4 years and erase the time he had lost with his daughter. Rose sat across from him, her posture tense, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as if bracing herself for a conversation she had spent years avoiding. Lily was still perched at the counter, happily sipping on a glass of juice, her small legs swinging beneath the stool. She was blissfully unaware of the emotional battlefield playing out just a few feet away. Nick leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. His voice was steady, but there was no missing the edge of frustration still lingering beneath it. I need to be in her life, Rose. I don't care how we figure it out, but I'm not walking away from her. Rose exhaled slowly, looking down at the table before meeting his gaze again. I know, she admitted. And I'm not going to stop you. Nick studied her carefully. He had expected more resistance, more hesitation. But the way she said it, so certain, so resigned, told him she had already made peace with the fact that keeping him away wasn't an option anymore. He nodded, running a hand through his hair. Good. Because I'm not asking for permission. Rose's lips pressed into a tight line. I didn't think you were. A moment of silence passed between them, thick with everything they hadn't said. Nick didn't just want to be a part of Lily's life, he needed to be. But he also knew this wasn't something that could happen overnight. She didn't know him, and no matter how much he wanted to make up for lost time, he had to accept that it would take time for her to trust him. Rose must have read the thoughts on his face because she sighed, her hands loosening their grip on the table. She doesn't know anything about you, she admitted. I never told her about you. Nick clenched his jaw, but he forced himself to stay calm. Not even my name. Rose shook her head. She asked once, a long time ago, why she didn't have a dad like some of the other kids at daycare. I told her that families come in all different forms and that ours was just the two of us. After that, she stopped asking. Nick's chest tightened. She deserves to know the truth. I know, Rose said, and for the first time that night, her voice cracked slightly. But you have to understand, Nick, she's never had a father figure in her life. She doesn't know what that means. She's used to it just being the two of us. Nick exhaled, forcing himself to push down the emotions threatening to rise. Then we take it slow, he said. I don't want to overwhelm her. Rose hesitated before nodding. Okay. Nick leaned back in the booth, trying to process how quickly everything had changed. Hours ago, he had walked into this restaurant expecting nothing more than a quiet meal, and now he was sitting across from the mother of his child, trying to figure out how to be a father to a daughter he had never known existed. Rose's voice softened slightly. She likes you, you know. Nick's eyes flicked up to meet hers. She does. Rose nodded, glancing toward the counter where Lily was now drawing on a napkin with a red crayon the waitress had given her. She's not usually that comfortable with strangers. But she let you hold her hand. That's not something she does often. Nick felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at Lily again, watching the way she scrunched up her face in concentration as she carefully traced a shape on the napkin. He didn't deserve this instant acceptance from her, but he wasn't going to waste it either. I want to take her out sometime, he said finally. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. Just me and her. Rose hesitated but then nodded. We can try that. Nick exhaled slowly, some of the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time since this conversation started. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough. But it was a start. And for now, that was all he could ask for. Nick arrived at the park earlier than planned, pacing near the playground as he tried to settle the unease in his chest. It had been 2 days since his conversation with Rose, 2 days since he had learned he had a daughter, and yet everything still felt surreal. He had spent those nights lying awake, replaying the moment over and over in his head, trying to come to terms with how drastically his life had changed in the span of a single evening. He wasn't afraid of responsibility. He had built an empire from the ground up, made decisions that affected thousands of lives, navigated pressure that would have broken most men. But this was different. This wasn't business. This was personal. A gust of wind rustled the autumn leaves, and Nick glanced toward the entrance of the park just as Rose appeared, walking hand in hand with Lily. His breath caught slightly as he took them in, the way Lily bounced slightly with each step, chattering excitedly to her mother about something, her tiny hands waving animatedly in the air. Rose, on the other hand, looked more reserved, her shoulders tense, as if she was still bracing for how this was all going to go. Nick swallowed hard, forcing himself to push down the nerves creeping up his spine. He wasn't going to let them get the best of him. He had waited too long for this moment, even if he hadn't known it before. Lily spotted him first. She stopped mid-sentence, blinking up at him as if assessing whether he was still the same person from the restaurant. Then, to his surprise, she grinned. "You're here," she announced, tugging at Rose's hand before breaking into a run. Nick barely had time to react before she reached him, stopping just inches away as she tilted her head up at him with a curious expression. "Did you bring me a book?" Nick let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Of all the things she could have said, he hadn't expected that. But it made him smile. "I did," he said, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a small, hardcover storybook. "Your mom told me you like fairy tales." Lily gasped dramatically, clutching her hands to her chest. "I love fairy tales." She took the book from his hands, turning it over in her small fingers. "Are there dragons?" Nick crouched down to her level, nodding. "Big ones. And princesses who aren't afraid of them." Lily grinned. "I like princesses who fight dragons. They're cooler than the ones who just wait for a prince." Nick chuckled, glancing up at Rose, who was watching them with a guarded expression. He could tell she was still trying to process how easily Lily had taken to him. He didn't blame her. He was just as surprised. "Do you want me to read it to you?" he asked, shifting his attention back to Lily. Lily thought about it for a moment, then nodded enthusiastically. "But only if we sit on the swings. It's the best place for stories." Nick hesitated, glancing at Rose for approval. She gave a small nod, her lips pressing together as if she was still deciding how she felt about all of this. "Swings it is," Nick said, straightening up. Lily grabbed his hand without hesitation, pulling him toward the playground. Nick let himself be led, still in awe of how naturally she accepted him. He had expected distance, hesitation, maybe even resistance. But instead, she acted as if he had always been there, as if he was already a part of her world. As they reached the swings, Lily climbed onto one and motioned for him to sit on the one beside her. Nick obliged, holding the book in his lap as he opened it. Lily leaned in close, her legs kicking slightly as she waited for him to start. He began reading, his voice steady, but he was only half focused on the words. His mind kept drifting to the little girl beside him, to the way she listened with such rapt attention, to the way she already trusted him without question. It was humbling in a way nothing else had ever been. Halfway through the story, Lily suddenly reached for his sleeve, tugging it gently. "You have a nice voice," she said matter-of-factly. "Like a prince." Nick blinked, caught off guard. He wasn't sure why, but her words settled something deep inside him. Rose, who had been standing a few feet away, let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "That's a first," she murmured. Nick smirked, shaking his head before turning back to Lily. "You think so?" Lily nodded solemnly. "Yep. A prince or maybe a knight. Nick leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a playful whisper. Knights fight dragons, you know. Lily's eyes widened. That means you could be one. Nick chuckled, flipping the page. Guess we'll have to find out. Rose was still watching them, her arms crossed, but there was something softer in her expression now, something that told Nick she was seeing something she hadn't expected to see. They stayed at the park for hours, playing, talking, reading more stories. When it was finally time to leave, Lily hugged Nick without hesitation, wrapping her small arms around his waist. He froze for half a second before gently returning the hug, something in his chest tightening at the unexpected gesture. As Rose led her toward the car, Lily looked over her shoulder, waving. Bye, night Nick. Nick huffed out a laugh, shaking his head as he waved back. Rose lingered for a moment before finally meeting his gaze. That went better than I expected. Nick nodded. Yeah. It did. There was still so much to figure out. So many conversations left to have. But for the first time since all of this had started, Nick felt something close to peace. And for now, that was enough. Nick couldn't stop thinking about the way Lily had hugged him before leaving the park. It was such a small gesture, something most parents probably took for granted, but to him, it had meant everything. He hadn't expected it. He had barely known what to do when her little arms wrapped around him, trusting and warm. And yet, in that moment, something inside him had settled, something that had been restless since the night he learned the truth. Now, 2 days later, he stood outside Rose's apartment, shifting his weight as he waited for her to open the door. He had been invited this time, but that didn't make it any easier. He was still an outsider in their world, trying to figure out where he fit in. The door opened, and Rose stood there, her brown eyes scanning his face with the same guarded expression she always wore around him. But there was something different now, something less defensive. She stepped aside without a word, letting him in. The apartment was small but cozy. The living room was filled with bookshelves, a few framed pictures on the walls, and a couch that had clearly been through years of use. It wasn't grand or extravagant, but it felt like home. And for the first time, Nick realized just how little he actually knew about the life Rose had built for herself and their daughter. Lily's in her room, Rose said, closing the door behind him. She's been talking about you non-stop since the park. Nick felt something warm spread through his chest at that. He turned to face Rose fully. That's a good sign, right? She nodded slowly, crossing her arms. Yeah. It is. Before he could say anything else, small, hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. A second later, Lily appeared, wearing a bright yellow princess dress, a plastic tiara slightly crooked on her head. She stopped when she saw him, her eyes lighting up. You came. Nick smiled, crouching slightly. I told you I would. Lily beamed, then lifted the fabric of her dress as she twirled. I'm a princess today, she announced. But not the kind that waits for a prince. The kind that fights dragons. Nick let out a quiet chuckle. That's the best kind of princess. Lily nodded seriously. Mommy says you're staying for dinner. Nick glanced at Rose, who was now leaning against the kitchen counter, watching their interaction with a quiet expression. If that's okay with you. Rose shrugged. She insisted. Lily grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the couch. Do you like spaghetti? Mommy makes the best spaghetti. Nick let himself be led, sitting down as she climbed onto the couch beside him, her dress puffing up around her. I love spaghetti, he said. Do I get to help? Lily gasped. You want to help? He smirked, glancing at Rose. I think I can manage stirring a pot. Lily giggled, then leaned in as if she were about to tell him a very important secret. Mommy doesn't like when people mess up her kitchen. Rose rolled her eyes from across the room. Lily, don't scare him off before he even tries. Nick laughed, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest. This moment, sitting in their home, listening to Lily talk, watching Rose pretend she wasn't amused, felt real. It felt like something he had never allowed himself to want, something he had convinced himself he didn't need. But now that he was here, he realized just how wrong he had been. Dinner was easy. Surprisingly so. Lily talked the entire time, filling every silence with stories about school, her favorite books, and the way her stuffed animals had different voices when she played with them. Nick listened, genuinely fascinated by the way her mind worked. Every now and then, Rose would interject, rolling her eyes at Lily's dramatics or reminding her to actually eat her food instead of just talking about it. And then there was the moment he hadn't expected. After dinner, Lily pulled out a stack of crayons and a few sheets of paper, setting up on the coffee table. She was drawing something with intense concentration, her tongue poking out slightly as she worked. Nick leaned over, watching her. "What are you making?" Lily looked up at him, then down at the paper before holding it up for him to see. It was a picture, 3 stick figures, one clearly smaller than the others, all holding hands. There was a house in the background, a sun in the corner, and a big blue scribble above them that he assumed was the sky. She pointed at each figure as she spoke. "This is me. This is Mommy. And this," she tapped the tallest figure. "This is you." Nick stared at the drawing, something tight forming in his throat. He wasn't sure what to say, wasn't sure how to process the fact that, in her mind, he was already part of her life. Rose, who had been clearing the table, glanced over. Her eyes softened when she saw the drawing, but she didn't say anything. She just let the moment sit between them, giving him space to take it in. Nick cleared his throat, forcing himself to speak past the lump there. "That's a pretty amazing drawing." Lily beamed. "Do you like it?" Nick nodded. "I love it." Lily seemed satisfied with that answer, immediately going back to coloring in the sky. Nick sat back, exhaling slowly as he ran a hand through his hair. He had spent his entire life chasing success, thinking that was the only thing that mattered. But sitting here, watching his daughter draw their family on a piece of paper, he realized he had been wrong. He didn't just want to be a part of her life. He needed to be. Nick wasn't sure how long he sat there, staring at the drawing Lily had made. It was just a simple picture, scribbled with bright colors and uneven lines, but to him, it meant more than anything else he had achieved in his life. His name had been on Forbes covers, on corporate buildings, on contracts worth millions, yet here it was, drawn in crayon beside 2 stick figures labeled Mommy and Lily, as if he had always belonged there. Lily, oblivious to the weight of what she had done, continued coloring, humming softly to herself. Rose moved around the apartment, gathering plates and wiping down the counters, but every now and then, he caught her watching him. She wasn't looking at him with anger anymore, or even with hesitation. It was something softer, something that almost made him wonder if she had been waiting for this moment just as much as he had. "Lily," Rose finally said, breaking the silence. "It's almost bedtime." Lily let out a dramatic sigh, setting down her crayon as if the weight of responsibility was too much for her to bear. "Do I have to?" Rose arched a brow. "Do you want to be a grumpy dragon tomorrow?" Lily considered this for a moment before sighing again, clearly defeated. "Fine." Nick watched as she stood up, stretching her arms before turning to him with wide, expectant eyes. "Are you gonna be here tomorrow?" Nick hesitated, glancing at Rose. He wasn't sure what the right answer was, wasn't sure if he was overstepping, but before he could even speak, Rose gave a small nod, barely noticeable but enough to tell him she wasn't going to push him away. He looked back at Lily and smiled. "Yeah. I'll be here." Lily grinned, satisfied with his answer. She walked over, hesitated for just a second, then wrapped her small arms around his middle, hugging him tight. Nick barely had time to react before she pulled away, running off down the hall to her room. He sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. It had only been days since he found out about her, and yet somehow, she had already decided he belonged. Rose leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching him carefully. "She's already attached to you," she said quietly. "You can't disappear." Nick met her gaze, something solid and unwavering in his own. "I'm not going anywhere." Rose studied him for a long moment before nodding. She pushed off the counter, heading toward the hallway, but before she disappeared, she paused. "Good night, Nick." It was the first time she had said his name without tension, without hesitation, without a wall between them. He exhaled, leaning back against the couch. "Good night, Rose." As he sat there, listening to the faint sound of Lily giggling from her room as Rose read her a bedtime story, Nick realized that for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was running after something he could never catch. He wasn't chasing another deal, another success, another number on a balance sheet. For the first time, he was exactly where he needed to be. And he wasn't going to let it go.